I'm Stephen Tobin, the Executive Director of the Labor Market Information Council.
The elephant in the room is obviously COVID-19. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on the Canadian labor market, and what does that tell us about the future of work?
Look, I think I'm not one for hyperboles, but I think it's easy to say that what we've seen is unprecedented, at least since we've been tracking these numbers, right? If I put my lens hat back to March and April, the Canadian economy lost 3 million jobs, which is really nothing like we've seen before. And we lost those jobs in 2 months, March and April. Now, to kind of put that in context, what does that mean, 3 million jobs in 2 months? If we look back to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the Canadian job market shed 500,000 jobs over about an 8-month period. So really, nothing like we've seen before. And if anything, if we were to compare the job losses in March and April, they are more than the job losses of the past 3 recessions combined. So really, nothing like we've seen before. We have, of course, since summer, recouped some of those jobs, but there have obviously been some considerable distributional impacts of who've been hurt the most. Now, when I think, what does that mean for the future of work? A couple of things come obviously to mind. The first is kind of an analogy that, when you look in kind of the side mirror where it says objects are closer maybe than they appear. So for me, I think the future of work is much closer to the present than we would have anticipated. I mean, it goes without saying that technology has really fundamentally reshaped how we work and how we learn. And so that concern around the future of work, I think, is much more present than we thought. I think what it also sort of tells me, at least in terms of how some of the impacts have sort of unfolded, is that we are, I think, more or less very unprepared for rapid transformations. And we know that this is not going to be the last crisis that the world of work sees. And so as we think about preparing for the future of work, I think we need to recognize that there's been, I think, some uncovering of our lack of preparedness for what's to come in terms of the changes.
Why are we behind? And how do you assess the current policies, federal policies, as they relate to skills development? Is there anything that you feel is sorely missing, or anything that is perhaps misguided, or just something that needs to be done in a different way?
As we think about building that kind of new infrastructure, there's a few key things in mind I think that we need to be doing. The first one is understanding what are the skill requirements of jobs, right? Which we don't know. Our entire way of thinking and collecting data is what type of education, credential, or qualification is required for a job. That's how we collect information. It's how we've been collecting information for decades. But now what matters is, what are the skills of the jobs? How are those skills changing in the current context or as we move forward and think about the future of work? And so that's the first piece I think that we need to be working on. The second piece, of course, is information is only good if you're actually able to use it. So if I know what the skills are of a certain job that I'm interested in undertaking, and I know that there's a good opportunity out there for me to sort of acquire those skills and get a job or find a new job, then where do I get the training and education required to sort of acquire those skills? And I think that's sort of the next sort of big missing piece from a data infrastructure perspective. Employers obviously need to do a little bit better job in terms of how they articulate the needs of jobs. The education training institutes need to think more carefully about how their programs lead not only to credentials and pieces of paper, but how they lead to sort of skills development and acquisition. And so there's lots of things that need to sort of happen around those two main things. But I think if we can get a better handle on what are the skill requirements of jobs, how they are changing, and where and how individuals and training institutions and employers can support individuals in acquiring those skills to get the new job or the better job, then I think we'll have done, I think, a tremendous service to the skills development space in the current context.
What should we be doing now to prioritize basically helping Canadian workers recover? In other words, get back to work and hopefully even emerge from this crisis stronger, in other words, better equipped, more skilled, so that they can thrive in the future economy?
Look, the two things I would say in terms of the skills development space is yes. First and foremost, we need to set our sights on policies and programs to help those that have been most impacted, right? And here, the warning for me, I guess, to policymakers would be the same toolkit from previous crisis doesn't necessarily hold. You know, when I think about the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, of course, infrastructure, shovel-ready projects, very much a la mode in terms of how we stimulate economic activity. And those are still good things to think about. But are those the right policies and programs that would help some of the people that have been most impacted? Low educated, women, youth, recent immigrants, right? So are we using the right toolkit to address those that have been most impacted? And so here I think we need to think a little bit outside the crisis thinking box, if you will. The other thing I would say is the impacts that have very much sort of revealed these vulnerabilities have shown that there are some structural issues to address, right? Either in terms of remuneration of people in some of these service-oriented jobs, their access to benefits such as sick leave. And so I think if we're going to address long-standing issues of inequality, we need to be thinking about those. I do, however, want to emphasize that there is another element to this, that talent is now, if it wasn't already, is definitely global in nature in terms of how we think about acquiring talent, right? Even within Canada, the borders have been opened up, if you will, in terms of how you think about recruiting, right? I no longer think about recruiting people in Ottawa, but recruiting basically across the country. And so I think when we think and consider addressing kind of structural issues in terms of competition and ensuring that Canada is sort of a leader in global talent development, we mustn't lose sight that there is also a higher tier of skills development when we think about technologies, artificial intelligence, that we need to bear in mind. So yes, need to make sure that policies and programs address, I think first and foremost, those vulnerabilities. But at the same time, there is a bigger sort of revolution, if you will, in terms of technology and the interactions of those other drivers we talked about earlier that I think necessitate slightly different strategy if Canada wants to become a leader in global talent development. And both those strategies are needed.
If you had 30 seconds to pitch someone in a position of power in Canada, the Prime Minister, the government, industry leaders, academic leaders, or perhaps even the youth itself, to improve skills development in this recovery that we're all waiting for, who would you pitch? And what would you say in 30 seconds or less?
Well, if I had a choice as to who I would pick, obviously I would make a pitch to the Prime Minister and all provincial and territorial leaders, I think, for that matter. And the pitch, I think, would go as follows, and maybe summarizes to some extent what we've been talking about today. I think the nature of this health pandemic has illustrated to us that behind good policy and program decisions is good data. And as we think about building a sustainable recovery from a workforce and skills development perspective, clearly we need better data on skills. It's one piece of the puzzle, but it's an essential one. And right now, while it's starting to bubble up and we're thinking about turning ideas into action, there is a gap in terms of how we think about skills and skilled data. And so I would say the Labor Market Information Council stands ready to work with all of its partners and collaborators to close that gap so we can develop a skills development strategy for Canada that's based on good, solid data and information.